The river looked quiet. Brown water, thick vegetation, rice fields disappearing toward the horizon. A column of armored boats moved slowly through the Mekong Delta. On their decks were American infantrymen. Machine guns covered both banks. Sailors searched the tree line. Nobody knew exactly where the enemy was, and that was the problem. The boats had to remain inside the channel. The enemy did not. A Viet Cong gunner could wait behind vegetation, only a few yards from the water. A mine could be hidden beneath the surface. A recoilless rifle could fire from the bank and disappear before American troops even reached shore. Then the silence could end in seconds. Machine guns opened up. Rounds struck armor. American weapons answered from the river. Infantrymen prepared to go ashore. Helicopters were called. Artillery coordinates went out. A peaceful waterway had become a battlefield. This was America's war in the Mekong Delta. And by 1967, the United States had created one of the strangest fighting forces of the entire Vietnam War to fight it. An army that lived on water. Infantry traveled aboard armored landing craft. Heavy weapons moved with them. Command posts floated. Medical facilities floated. Repair shops floated. Artillery could even be positioned on barges. The entire force could move from one part of the delta to another and launch an assault almost directly from the river. It was called the Mobile Riverine Force. To the men who fought there, the rivers were not obstacles. They were roads, and America intended to turn those roads against the Viet Cong. But there was a deeper question. If the United States could dominate the rivers with armored boats, helicopters, artillery, and infantry, could it actually control the Mekong Delta? The answer would reveal one of the central contradictions of the Vietnam War. To understand why the Mobile Riverine Force existed, first look at the battlefield. South of Saigon, the Mekong Delta spread across a huge portion of southern Vietnam. This was one of the country's most important agricultural regions. Millions of people lived there. Rice production made the delta economically essential. But militarily, it was a nightmare. The landscape was broken by rivers, canals, streams, flooded fields, swamps, and narrow embankments. In many areas, roads were limited. During the wet season, movement became even harder. A conventional American formation built around trucks and armored vehicles could not simply drive wherever it wanted. The Viet Cong had spent years operating inside this environment. They knew the waterways. They knew the villages. They knew which canals were deep enough for boats. They knew where government troops rarely went. Local forces could move through areas that were difficult for larger conventional units to penetrate. That gave communist units something extremely valuable: freedom of movement. By the second half of 1966, American commanders believed several U.S. brigades would be needed in the upper Mekong Delta to challenge Viet Cong main force units and support the South Vietnamese government's effort to expand control in the countryside. The U.S. 9th Infantry Division was arriving in Vietnam. One of its brigades was about to receive an unusual mission. The 2nd Brigade would not fight as a normal road-bound infantry formation. It would be paired with the United States Navy. The Navy component was Task Force 117. Together, they would become the Mobile Riverine Force. The concept was ambitious. Instead of building another large permanent base and forcing soldiers to travel long distances from it every time they went into combat, much of the force could move aboard ships. The Navy would provide the transportation and much of the firepower. The Army would provide the infantry. A group of converted landing craft would become an armored assault fleet. Some carried troops. Others carried guns. Others served as command vessels or medical boats. Behind them were larger support ships where soldiers could eat, sleep, receive medical care, repair equipment, and prepare for the next mission. It was closer to a floating military installation than a conventional army camp. One of the most recognizable vessels was the armored troop carrier. The soldiers often called it a tango boat. Its ancestry came from World War II landing craft. But Vietnam transformed it. Armor protected vulnerable sections. Machine guns and automatic weapons gave it the ability to fight its way toward a landing area. Inside could be an infantry element, preparing to step directly from the boat into combat. There were also monitors, heavily armed river assault craft designed to provide close fire support. Other boats performed reconnaissance, command, mine clearing, medical, or support roles. Together, they created a river assault column capable of moving a substantial combat force into territory where trucks could never go. But before this floating force could operate effectively, it needed somewhere to anchor its campaign. That place became Dong Tam. American engineers constructed the new base near Mai Tho in Din Tuong province. The location put the force near some of the most contested areas of the upper delta. Even building the base showed what kind of battlefield this was. Engineers had to transform difficult waterlogged terrain into a major military facility. The first elements of the 9th Infantry Division had arrived in Vietnam in December 1966. Over the following months, troops trained for amphibious operations. Then the fighting began, and very quickly they discovered that getting into enemy territory was not the same as controlling it. On May 3, 1967, American troops fought near Ap Bac. The name already carried history. 4 years earlier, in January 1963, South Vietnamese troops supported by American advisors and helicopters had suffered a humiliating setback near the same area. Now troops of the 9th Infantry Division encountered another Viet Cong force dug into prepared positions. The battle became brutal. American troops had armor. They had armed helicopters. They had an Air Force AC-47 gunship overhead. But the Viet Cong positions had to be destroyed at close range. The American force eventually overwhelmed the defenders. According to the official U.S. Army history, more than 200 enemy troops were reported killed. American losses were 15 dead and 27 wounded. The battle demonstrated exactly what U.S. forces could bring into the Delta: mobility, air power, armor, infantry, concentrated firepower. But the Mobile Riverine Force had been created for something even more ambitious. It was supposed to go deeper. On June 19, 1967, the first phase of Operation Coronado began. The target was an enemy-controlled area, stretching between Can Guoc and Rach Cat. The operation was exactly the kind of mission the Riverine concept had been designed to perform. Minesweepers went first. Behind them came the assault boats, monitors, command vessels, armored troop carriers. American infantry landed on different sides of the objective. The plan was to squeeze the enemy inside a tightening cordon. At first, there was almost no resistance. That could be reassuring. Or it could mean the Americans were walking directly toward something. 2 companies on the left flank moved forward. Then the Viet Cong opened fire. The Americans had entered a prepared ambush. Casualties mounted quickly. American units attacked the enemy position repeatedly. They could not break through. By nightfall, the Mobile Riverine Force had managed to establish a cordon around 3 sides of the enemy position. The Americans believed they had them. The Riverine concept appeared to be working. Boats had delivered troops into difficult terrain. Infantry had moved around the enemy. Firepower was available. Blocking positions were forming. All that remained was to finish the encirclement. The Americans renewed their advance the following morning. The enemy was gone. Somehow, during the night, the Viet Cong force had escaped. Captured documents and prisoners later suggested the enemy had suffered significant losses. But the episode exposed the problem that would follow American forces throughout the Delta. They could arrive unexpectedly. They could hit hard. They could almost surround an enemy formation. But almost was not enough. In the maze of canals, rice paddies, villages, and vegetation, an opening that seemed insignificant on a map could become an escape route. The Viet Cong did not always need to defeat the Mobile Riverine Force. Sometimes they only needed to survive long enough to disappear. The Americans adjusted. They became better at coordinating river movement with helicopter insertions. They established blocking positions. They used South Vietnamese troops to close escape routes. They learned how to move infantry between waterways and landing zones more rapidly. In July, the force struck the Bin Xuan secret zone. American units established patrol bases along rivers bordering the enemy stronghold. Infantry came in by helicopter and landing craft. Ambush positions were established. Over several days, U.S. forces reported killing or capturing more than 100 enemy troops without suffering combat casualties themselves. That was the Mobile Riverine Force operating the way its planners had imagined. Reach an area the enemy considered secure. Move rapidly. Close the waterways. Insert infantry. Force the enemy to react. But the bigger fights were still coming. Later that month, intelligence indicated a major communist buildup in Din Tuong province. A much larger Allied operation began. The Mobile Riverine Force moved from the south. Other U.S. and South Vietnamese forces established blocking positions. The goal was no longer simply to search an enemy base. It was to construct a trap. 2 riverine battalions landed at 5 locations and began pushing north. At first they encountered little resistance. Then South Vietnamese Marines entered the Ban Long area. They were hit immediately. For 5 hours they tried to seize the enemy position. They failed. Another assault was launched that night with American artillery support. It failed again. But now the Viet Cong had another problem. Routes out of the area were being closed. South Vietnamese Rangers waited on one side. American infantry blocked others. The enemy tried to break through the Marines the following morning. They could not. Some fighters abandoned their weapons and attempted to disappear among civilians. Others tried to escape toward the Mai Tho River. The riverine battalions moved again. American units and South Vietnamese forces formed a broad horseshoe-shaped cordon around the battle area. Now the water itself helped close the trap. This was the promise of the Mobile Riverine Force, not simply boats carrying soldiers, but multiple forces arriving from different directions faster than the enemy expected. The river had become a maneuver corridor, and the Americans were becoming increasingly dangerous on it. Yet the same environment remained deadly for the sailors themselves. The boats were armored, but they were not invulnerable, and waterways created predictable movement. A patrol might have several routes available, but once it entered the narrow channel, the choices disappeared. The boat had to continue forward or reverse. Both riverbanks could hide weapons. Vegetation could conceal fighters until the range was extremely short. Mines were another threat. The crews scanned the water constantly. A riverbank that looked empty could contain a firing position. A harmless-looking boat could demand attention. A bend in a canal could hide an ambush. For men operating in the open compartments of rivercraft, there was nowhere psychologically distant from the battlefield. The battlefield surrounded them. Then, at the end of January 1968, the war changed. Tet. Communist forces launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. Cities and towns that had appeared relatively secure suddenly became battlefields. Saigon was attacked. Hue was attacked. Provincial capitals came under assault. The Mekong Delta erupted as well. The Mobile Riverine Force had originally been preparing for operations farther west. Those plans became irrelevant.